How's that? Is that coming? Is that coming? Oh, there we go.
Awesome.
Fingers crossed.
And now you get double. I didn't know whether you'd ordered it or not.
It's on the list. It's not something I've done yet.
Yeah. You basically want me to work so that you can just go and buy it and work, right?
I didn't take all that.
I know how you work. I've seen it before. Now is it working? Now we are going to hear third talk in this room, but just a little reminder, I hope you are tweeting. Don't forget there will be a grand finale at 4:30 in room D105 with special prizes. We have some posters up for grabs if you're interested. With this, let me pass the floor to Jim Perrin, who's going to talk about ARM.
Thank you. So my name is Jim Perrin. I've been with the CentOS project now for a little over a decade. And in that time, I've taken a few different roles with the project. Most recently, I've been working on handling ARM builds for the data center. I apologize if I sound a little hoarse. I am. You guys are lucky this isn't a talk happening through interpretive dance. It was a bit of a rough night.
Bring on the dance.
You don't want to see that. So, for about the last year, almost exactly a year to the day, I got my first ARM64 box. A bit hush-hush here, sneak this home from FOSDEM, work on it, see what you can do with it, see what you can make happen. And so we began the initial build of CentOS for 64-bit ARM hardware. We started with the 7.0 release and plagiarized quite heavily from some of Fedora's patch sets. Thank you, Peter. But the majority of the 7.0 code built. There were a few issues that we ran into. Most of them were easily solvable, a few patches here and there to pull in. That all worked fairly well. And then I got a call from a few of the Red Hat guys saying, what are you doing? Wait until 7.1. Why? Well, we can't tell you that. Just wait until 7.1. Okay, fine. The beta's already out. It shouldn't be too much longer. So I still continued to do a lot of the build, but I kept it kind of private. Do we have any? Is there anybody here who's not Red Hat in the room? Who's not in the family? Okay. So while this was going on, I still continued to build, but I was kind of keeping my eyes on the package sets and the package lists for 7.1. The sources for RHELSA 7.1 drop, and miraculously, hey, there's a RHELSA port for it. We have full-on RHELSA sources. And a lot of the packages or patches for ARM look suspiciously like the things that I've been, ripping apart from Fedora and backporting into the RHEL patches. So the other direction. It built a lot easier the second time around. But we had issues with, and I can't say we had issues. The vendors that we were working with seemed to be having issues, mostly focusing around distribution. They were trying to get a lot of the Red Hat stuff out there. They wanted to be able to give it to customers. They wanted to be able to get the testing out there. And they were struggling with being able to do some of this. So with what we have, we offer essentially a more easily distributable method for pushing a lot of the same things. What I'm trying to get to is a place where we have full parity with x86-64 architecture on ARM for data centers. I want it to be just bog simple and easy to use. There should not need to be a different set of instructions or installation methods or anything else. The hardware shouldn't, the installation for the software should not be the differentiator. The hardware should be. I want the chips to compete on their own merit. If the low power benefit for ARM or more cores for ARM makes a difference, great. If you want power, great, go for that. But I want the chips to compete, not necessarily the software stack. And who in here is familiar with the pain of U-boot, other than Peter? So that's one of the things that initially we have avoided dealing with. My focus initially was on ARM in data centers. We've got a pretty good handle on that now. So these days, we're focusing a little more, as more 64-bit ARM consumer boards come out, we're getting more requests from the community. Yes, Geekbox, thank you. The Pine 64, things like that. As these boards are coming out, we're getting requests for the 64-bit build of ARM on these devices. But I've been focused on UEFI and the server boot standard specs, the different things.
We have it in Fedora as well, been focused on UEFI and the SBSA standards, simply because that was the hardware we had available for us to test on.
And it's nice to not have to deal with vendor-specific things. When you can just say, this is the standard, this is how we're doing it, please come play. Now there's a threat. But it's not all fun and games. I've been playing both sides of the fence. It's kind of what I do. The vendors that we've been working with have also been trying to get additional patches in. I don't have to worry about SLAs. We're community. So for some of the hardware vendors, we're able to move a little faster. We're able to pull in additional patches that either the Fedora folks may look at a little.
Sorry, did you say extra crap?
I said additional patches. How you interpret that is entirely up to you. Some of the patches, so one of the vendors, and I'm not going to name names because as someone so kindly reminded me, there is video and there is a microphone, and God, I don't want a lawsuit. One of the vendors, when I told them that we would accept patches and push faster kernel versions, or at least faster patched versions of the standard CentOS kernel, they said, great, and they shipped me one bulk, I want to say it was like a 19,000 line patch for the kernel. There were multiple patches. One of them was around 19, and it was like, oh yeah, that whole ACPI thing, we don't need that, we're kicking that out, we're going back to device tree, we're doing this, we're doing... No. In no way will I accept this patch, just full stop, absolutely not. I don't claim to be a kernel developer. Let me ship this to a few other people, but this doesn't smell right to me. I mailed it to a few of the other folks who screamed and then started laughing, so I felt I was right in kicking that back. But that was just one instance. We have a number of other, there are 4 other vendors that are working very well with us. And for the most part, they are just pushing slightly newer versions or added support features for the hardware that we've already got. So some of the additional newer patches for Mustang to support IPMI, things like that, that's great, bring it on. And so what we're doing is we're running a bit of dual stack development. We have the traditional CentOS-focused build on ARM, and then each month we're putting out limited feature release improvements that are mostly focused around the kernel, but the occasional toolset patch. And so we've been doing that now for roughly 6 months, and we've had a lot of community uptake for it. In handling the server world with that, I'm completely ignoring my slides here, so yeah. Essentially what we're doing is distributing the base, distributing updates. Extras, we have a few in that. I haven't thrown a lot into extras, mostly because a large chunk of that should be coming from Apple. So I've been putting on my other hat, leaning on the Apple release engineering folks, the Fedora release engineering folks, and saying, hey, can we please get Apple rebuilt for ARM? And they keep telling us, no, we're focused on other things like power.
No, that's entirely not true. We need to have hardware in the data center that we can use to build it, because we need to be able to plug it into the private coding infrastructure.
And your magical requirements for functioning hardware that might be supported, you know.
And so I can honestly say we now actually have enterprise level hardware sitting in a rack in the Phoenix data center. It's been waiting for network for 2 months. One day, sometime this year, we will get network, and we will then be able to start to look at Apple for layout 64. And by then, I will almost have been over the process and not like quivering in the corner from doing the little power little endian Apple bringer.
I'm not sure we're doing the talk dynamic correctly. Is the speaker supposed to troll the audience, or is it the other way around?
When it comes to ARM, both.
Okay.
You will see a lot of updates for each
Mm-hmm.
seven.
So the other thing that we have is an experimental repository. Peter, you're probably going to want earmuffs for the next little bit of this. We have been, so for the 7.1.1503 release, that was primarily focused around Docker builds. The initial Golang bootstrap to get 1.5 support for ARCH64 built was unique and special in all sorts of interesting ways.
The term is ropey.
Little details like, hey, maybe the page size shouldn't, or might maybe want to match what everything else is doing on the system.
Which of three values?
So we got Golang support built in. We got Docker support built in. It works. It is mostly,
I love this word.
I said mostly. It is mostly operational, as long as we're not getting unique with all sorts of fun Docker things. So that's where we're putting the experimental repo. Community. The other half of it is we've got a chunk of the community user space right now that is pushing very hard for certain compatibility layers. And this is where I say you're going to want your earmuffs, because ILP32 is a thing. And who's familiar with this? So for whatever reason, there is a large chunk of the ARM community who would like to have backwards compatibility for ARM v5, ARM v6 applications, a few other oddball things that may have been built against old hardware. They want to just run this natively on ARH64. They equate it to, hey, I can run i386 or i686 applications on an x86-64. It is not remotely the same thing when it comes to ARM.
Are your customers, do they know that not all ARM v8 CPUs support this default?
They are aware of this. This is an ongoing discussion right now. This may land in experimental, it may not. My requirement has been there has to be a good faith effort to get things upstreamed that stands a fair chance of success. And right now, that last bit is what is killing the ILP32 movement. There have been patches pushed upstream to both the kernel and glibc folks who have roundly slapped it around and said no. So until that changes and until there's a patch set that looks like it might actually maybe get committed, I have a really hard time saying, yes, we can pull that in, even in an experimental state.
So my only comment about that is we've always said the best way to do ARM32 on ARM64 is to run it in a VM.
Mm-hmm.
And that worked really, really, really well. The issue, well, but it's your community. You can make a rod for your own back because I don't need to deal with it.
So
It won't be going anywhere near Apple.
no, that is absolutely not something that I would push out for consumption other than in an experimental thing. And even that is questionable. It is an ongoing community discussion. They have been asking about it, asking for it on the mailing lists. What we're working on short to medium term right now is actually adding in ARH64, ARM64 hardware to CBS, the community builders that Brian Stinson was talking about earlier, the infrastructure that Fabian was bringing up earlier. We're plumbing hardware into this and into CI so that we can validate and make sure that everything we're doing on the ARM side is exactly as it should be on the x86-64 side. Again, we're trying to go for parity. We have recently gotten boxes stood up in the data center that actually got network connectivity. That was a miracle, but it happened. It's connected. It actually works. And so we're going to be starting the community. Is Niels DeVos hiding in the room? He was in here earlier. I don't know if he snuck out. He's not. Okay. So we have the gluster builds coming online as our first proof of concept, and then the RDO folks have been roundly tossed under the bus so that we can get openstack going on ARH64 very soon as well. Yeah, it works. I have it running. It works. I just need to do it community. It has to be out in the open, not just in my private build system at home where it's sketchy. Okay, yeah, we're doing good. So essentially, we have the CI infrastructure coming up. We have all of the server space that's needed. Now we're getting more into the community boards. We've kind of waved the mission accomplished banner for the server stuff, and until the hardware becomes more generally available for server hardware, there isn't a whole lot more that we can push. Once we can turn the community builds over for the various projects, the glusters, the Cephs, the openstacks, once those communities are able to make their builds public, the only real market left for us to push for is the community stuff. But all of the community hardware is ignoring UEFI. They're doing the same old thing they've always done. They're doing the same traditional approach because U-boot is a thing, and as much as I hate it, it works for their use case, for what they're doing.
It's cheap.
It is cheap.
You can run UEFI on high key.
So the high key has a special brand of hate in my heart right now.
I haven't played, but I follow you.
And mine.
I have a build set up for the high key. It works. You can go get it right now. Building the disk layout table, the ptable.bin, is a bit of a pain. And if I take the ptable that they ship, which is admittedly for their Debian-based, their Ubuntu-based distribution, it works, but they have their UEFI directory set as /boot, not /boot/EFI, like Fedora and other sane distributions have. So it becomes an interesting dynamic in finding the right EFI files and putting the image together correctly, because the installer wants to do one thing and their disk layout wants to do something different. It also gets really particular with the fastboot update to move the image from one to the other. It's exceptionally temperamental about the size of the image. So even if you're well under the onboard disk space, it gets finicky about, you know what, I don't need to write this whole file. I'm just going to truncate that last 100 megs because you didn't really need that, did you?
So there's an interesting patch series that has just been sent upstream. It hasn't quite been accepted yet. But
I'm not shocked.
But it actually implements most of the UEFI services in native U-boot.
We have discussed this. This is hopefully a saving grace where Fedora and CentOS are going to be collaborating, possibly commiserating, and drinking heavily. How many of you went to the beer event last night? Excellent. So the patch set that Peter's talking about allows you to shim some of the UEFI features into a soon-to-be upstreamed U-boot and hopefully fake enough of the funk that we can get things booted and working normally. Neither one of us has tested this yet. We're both pinning high hopes on it, and we'll probably be sobbing and crying and, gnashing of teeth.
At the moment, there's two pieces of cheap ARM64 hardware that I'm hoping to support in the F24 cycle.
Wave it around.
So one is the Geekbox, which I have here. The other is Pine 64, which is apparently sitting in my postbox, or probably on my front porch getting rained upon at home at the moment. Neither of those currently have upstream U-boot support. I intend on getting out a roll of gaffer tape and a bunch of bubble gum and trying to make that a thing in the F24 timeframe, and so that I don't actually have to drink heavily and deal with Anaconda and install processors and various other bits and pieces. I'll be playing with the UEFI patches to see if it works. So it'll be a watch the Fedora ARM space over the next couple of months as we ramp up towards Fedora 24.
This is part of the whole keeping it all in the family thing. So in this, for the ARM space right now, Fedora and CentOS are playing reasonably nicely together and collaborating fairly well for the majority of it. It seems to be going well. We have So I have the Pine 64. It arrived about 2 days before I came here, so I haven't had a chance to play with it other than to notice, hey, that's bigger than all of the other ARM sockets. But for $15, I'm not going to care. Is there anything else in here that I care about showing? No. Okay. So yeah, basically the only thing that I haven't mentioned here that's in slides that I'm really sort of passionate about is, in addition to the installer and Pixie support and everything else, on the server hardware, we're doing developer disk images, which we essentially have the userland support with the kernel bits ripped out and some brief instructions for the different vendors to drop in their own kernel bits. You say tomato, I say, yes. Some of it, I would desperately love it if the ARM folks would stop doing one-off kernels and forking them on GitHub and claiming that that's upstream, because you can go look at the code and they're one monolithic, just giant patch set. I might be a little bitter on some of this. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to interrupt me. Peter already has been the whole time. It's fine. It's not a problem. Yes?
Do you have any idea what's the status with Ubuntu? Are they suffering from the same issues? Are they ahead of us in integration?
They don't suffer from the same issues. They are quite happy to pull vendor kernel trees and throw any.
They are creating all new issues.
And it's kind of interesting because in Fedora /CentOS /RHELSA, we've always said it needs to be upstream. We can't maintain 100 different kernels for this, and that's been very much our principle. It cost Fedora quite a bit in the ARM space in the early days. It's now weighed out because we support about 200 or 300 individual devices out of the box, and it amazes me every week when someone comes along with this weird and wonderful device I've never heard of, and I've gone, oh God, what do they want me to do with it? And they just go, actually, no, it just works. And it's like, wow. If you look at the Ubuntu CVE stream for the ARM kernels, they are literally pumping out hundreds of them and are having massive problems keeping up with CVEs.
Take a look. Very recently, who watches the kernel CVEs and the whole keyring buffer thing that happened, what was that, 3 weeks ago?
Yeah, something like that.
Fedora had updates for this because they do kernel updates. We had updates for this because we do kernel updates. Most of the Ubuntu and other images don't. The update structure just is not there. They will throw an image out, they wave their hands, they say, look, it's supported, it runs, and then it's abandoned. The user space isn't usually a problem. The user space marches right along. The kernel and the tooling around the kernel, the occasional glibc, GCC, that's where things get interesting.
If you look at Ubuntu, if kernel is in universe, then you can assume that it's randomly supported.
That's a very polite way of saying it.
When I worked on Ubuntu and I got this Samsung Chromebook, it was perfectly fine for everything. I just pushed Linux Chromebook kernel into it, right, which was quite old, but it gave working image, right? I don't remember when last time I worked on it, right? I don't use any more Ubuntu anymore, I don't develop it. I will not be surprised if this kernel is still there.
We see that very frequently, not to pick on individual folks, but the hard kernel guys specifically. That's the one where I run into it a lot. They'll do one, hey, we forked this kernel at 3.10 or 4.2 or whatever. Here it is, come get it. And then there's just no movement on it from that point on.
3.10 rocks.
I'm not opposed to it as long as it gets, patches and is maintained. But it's that second part, it's the patches and maintained that tends to be a problem.
Which one was 8.5?
Anyway, moving on.
So the kernel side and the Ubuntu side, they tend to wave hands and say mission accomplished a lot faster than we do. We have higher standards. And when I say we, I mean, RHEL, Fedora, CentOS. If I tell you this hardware is going to work. I'm putting out updates for it. I'm not going to expose you to CVEs. The only exception to that is the developer disk image, where I load the gun and say, here, if you would like to shoot yourself, you may. I'm not going to.
If you want debian-based system, then just go for Debian.
Any other questions?
What's the status of Red Hat and the enterprise distribution of 64-bit?
That's a very good question. I don't know. They don't tell me these things. It is still it's beta developer tech preview something.
7.2, the entire user space is merged, so the user space is 100% like you see in all other architecture variants of RHEL. It is a developer preview, I think, and if you want it, you go and speak to your account manager. Anything else outside of that, I have no idea or cannot publicly say about it. So basically, I don't know what the plans are with 7.3, but the user space is 100% merged in, looks exactly like all other architectures of RHEL. It's officially, that's why I said user space is and it's there, but you speak to your account manager about it. And
The way that it's working right now is if you're a RHEL customer, you get access to the RHEL betas, except this one. This one you have to go talk to your account rep and get added into the super secret squirrel thing, and then you get it.
it's not even that super squirrel, you just have to go and speak to your account manager.
Which is an added step that, why? Anyway, not for me to judge, not for me to say, I don't care. I'm under the impression, I have been told, but again, we're not in any way related to the business unit, so I could be wrong. Feel free to correct. Been doing a great job so far. I love taking cheap shots at Peter. It's fantastic. Red Hat is not pushing the updates. Because it's the preview, they drop the release. This is what you're working with. It's expected that it's not a production thing. We are pushing updates for it. Every time there is a user space or a kernel update or CVE that comes out, we're patching the kernel outside on our own, but the user space gets the same updates that everything else does. So for us, it is a fully...
I don't believe that's entirely true.
It may not be. That may have changed.
But I think we can just leave it at, it's there, speak to your account manager about it, and any future intentions about it are not public. And I personally don't even know because I've got more than enough to deal with. And, basically what's some news feeds, press announcements, various other bits and pieces, but anything that may change as, 7.3, 7.4 comes along.
So more questions. I have 10 more minutes to kill, and I've completely ignored my slides. So what do you guys have? Hit me with ARM questions. KB.
So, I haven't been in the loop for that conversation. How soon do you think we'll actually have ARM hardware available for 6 to go do that?
The builder is available now. For the stuff that is already built for the SIGs in Koji, their option is essentially bump the release version because Koji gets particular about NVR. And so if the next iteration of their build where they have a slightly newer NVR string, then they'll be able to tag in the ARM builds and move on with life. If they want to build an equivalent version now because, say, the Gluster folks don't want to run different versions of 3.7, which is an entirely sane stance, and I wouldn't fault them for that, then they would have to do a scratch build, and we would have to work with them in the interim to make that scratch build an actual real honest-to-God thing. If they want to tack a 0.1 on the end of all their builds, then great, we can go do that now. The CI hardware should be coming into the data center in the next month to month and a half. At that point, I'm kind of at the mercy of the data center guys to get it plumbed in and networked, and I can throw estimates out for time frame all day long. I have no way to back that up.
Can they do some of the work with virtual machines?
The testing can work on virtual machine. We can get that set up, but it still has to have a network to talk to the outside world so that the community can actually get to it. And that has been the majority of the roadblock, I believe. So the hardware installation, the managing for the data center type stuff is entirely outside of my purview. I usually just throw stuff at Brian and say, hey, make this happen, and he goes off and talks to people and screams and yells, and stuff either happens or doesn't. So I yell at him, he yells at other people. It's a nice little cyclical thing. So anything else? Does anybody have other ARM64 boards other than Geekbox or Pine64 that they would like to see supported? Is there anything else that anybody is aware of? Other than the high key.
So if nobody has a question, then I have another question.
You haven't had your allocation.
So one of the big concerns, right, in our space is that every vendor does their own thing, right? So that's especially a big thing with ARM7, right? Pretty much every board is the same. So as the 6 come on board, how aware do they need to be about what platform is building on versus what platform is going to be used? Is that even a thing they need to think about, or is it just it's AR64 CentOS, my openstack works on VMs, which should work on it?
So the question being, do the SIGs need to care about individual hardware differences? And the answer is, it depends. If they have kernel modules or if they are relying specifically on something, some specific function of the hardware, in that instance, then maybe. If it's entirely a user space thing like Gluster or something along those lines, the user space works just fine, and the SIGs won't even notice. They just trigger a build, it builds, they move on with life, everybody installs their software, and they're happy.
So the big difference I see when it comes to the AR64 hardware is whether it supports SDSA or not. And one of the biggest questions I always get is, will the likes of the Pine board support SDSA? And
Never.
the answer is it is not actually possible to do so because it requires, while you can glue a UEFI bootloader in there and various other bits and pieces, there is specific requirements of certain bits of hardware, like a particular type of real-time clock, a particular type of serial console, and a few other bits and pieces that all the cheap devices actually don't ship with. So
I guess, but that's a part of the distribution side of things. Right? Should something like Gluster get?
no, basically, one of the things they've done with the ARMv8 spec is they've standardized a lot of stuff, and there is a 8.1 and an 8.2 spec which adds extra functionality in, but it's no different than different generations of the Intel processor, where they had MMX and then SSE and then SSE 2, 3, 4, 4.1, and so.
Most of the newer feature specs that are coming in, and I'm not sure what is public and what is not, so I'll be very vague and hand-wavy. A lot of it is a no-op if it's not supported. So for some of the new things, if it's not a supported feature, it just won't happen, and the software will continue on as if it doesn't. Maybe it's a little slower, you may not get the acceleration that you would expect, but it's not going to outright break.
In a lot of cases, the new functionality that's coming in is basically hardware acceleration of what is already capable in software.
Correct.
It's like in ARMv8 first specification, crypto instructions were optional. In 8.1, they are mandatory.
CRC32 is a wonderful thing.
Yeah. So in most cases, from most of the user space stuff, it's not going to make any difference at all. If it runs in one location, it will run everywhere, unless it's a hardware-specific bit of functionality.
Even down to if we had a SIG that wanted to change up some of the Anaconda bits, if Anaconda runs, then it won't make a difference because that would be user land enough that it shouldn't matter. It's just getting to the Anaconda bits with, hey, does it support Pixie? Do we support this bootloader? Do we have this type of memory register actually available? Or did we save 3 cents by not putting it there on the board, which is the case frequently. So, any other questions? No?
When Red Hat releases its official kernel for 64-bit, are you going to offer your as alternative or try to match somehow?
So the question is, what happens when Red Hat releases their official thing? We already have the source dump of the kernel. We get that now as Red Hat delivers the sources into git.centos with all the other distribution code. We build that, and the initial release kernel, because that's the newest kernel at the time, that goes into that initial release. So we have a roughly equivalent kernel there. What we're doing for these monthly builds is we're taking that kernel and adding in a few vendor fixes or updated patch sets on top of that. So it's always an additive process. When the new RHELSA kernel drops, those patches, whichever vendor has supplied them, is on the hook for porting those if they haven't already been merged in by Red Hat through some other means. So if the initial build was, I want to say a 3.18 or 3.19 kernel, and the Zen folks gave us a kernel patch to enable Zen support. This last kernel drop for the 7.15.11 build was a 4.2 based kernel. So we had to get a new patch set from Zen that covered the differences between 3.18, 3.19, whatever it was, and 4.2. If that kernel gets rebased again to something further on down the road, then we walk that process forward. So we're starting from what the RHEL kernel source is, the same as we always have in the past. We're just adding a few additional things in there as the community need for that arises. So we are still compatible, we're just also walking forward a bit more.
And in some cases, if you go from, say, 3.18 to 4.2, in that example, it could be that patch set that the vendor provided is now upstream, and the patch can just be dropped altogether.
Right. With our patch requirement to the vendors of there has to be a good faith effort in getting this upstream, a lot of it is really just a timing thing. The vendors may have missed the window for 4.1, and so they're scrambling to try and get it into 4.2, 4.3, 4.5, whatever. And it's been accepted, it just missed the merge window. So hey, it's been accepted, we can see it. I can go on LKML and find this. I'm fine pulling that in ahead of time because I know it's already in the upstream. I know it's going to work its way down. And once we hit that point, I can drop that patch off my list. I don't need to worry about it anymore, and we move on and cycle through. Yes? I don't care. Honestly, so Microsoft has been very beneficial in helping to drive some of the server standards. I honestly haven't looked in depth at what they're doing on a lot of the user boards, but a large chunk of the Microsoft code requires ACPI. So because they need ACPI for their distribution, it's been beneficial in leaning on the vendors to push ACPI further into the standard. But beyond that, whatever Microsoft's doing, I haven't touched Windows in 3 years, and I consider that a badge of honor. I have no intention of shifting that. So, all right. Thank you all very much. I will in just a second, even though I completely ignored them. Sorry about that. No.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Hopefully I didn't say anything inappropriate.
No, you didn't. Well, you mentioned Zen.
I've been fighting with the KVM guys trying to get a patch that I need